Well, good morning, everyone. I will be talking about wearable technologies for monitoring and managing patients, basically talking about the past, present, and future. The idea is to take you through the journey of the evolution of patient monitoring from the very, very big machines to the nowadays wearable technologies available in the market to do so. I will focus a lot in the wearables for clinical monitoring, particularly in those systems that were part of my experience and my career were developing these technologies. Wherever is possible, I'm going to try to talk about the contribution of doctors along this travel. And it's out of the scope of the presentation, talk about regulatory things or data protection. I think the two previous speakers did very well with that part. So what you got there is actually the clinical evolution of patient monitoring and the different challenges that have been taking place during different stages of the process. So looking at the very, very first at the left, even before that, there was already knowledge about the electrical activity in the heart and also how to measure that electrical activity in an invasive way. But it wasn't until 1901 when Einthoven came up with the first ECG machine, using, as you can see in the picture, some buckets as electrodes to measure the actual electric potentials of the heart, and a string galvanometer to print the strip. From that point in time, then the efforts were around making a machine that could be commercialized because, in fact, these machines were impractical. Then in about 1950, these systems were reduced in size. Still a little bit primitive. I mean, they were based on an analog electronics, barely capable of generate audible events like heart rate. The storage capabilities were like tapes to save ECG signals and then process them offline. And the other contribution of another doctor, I forgot to mention that Einthoven was a physiologist, was Dr. Paul Soll in a hospital in Boston. Together with his team, started to design these monitors together with the invention of the external pacemaker and defibrillators. So then you can see how then doctors from the beginning started to participate in the design of these technologies. Then by 1970, it was a requirement to start to introduce the measurement of other parameters like SpO2, non-invasive blood pressure, temperature, respiration, etc. Some of the systems started to incorporate digital technologies and processing capabilities. So then automatic arrhythmia detection algorithms started to emerge, as well as analysis of ST segment, etc. By the 90s, they became more portable in terms that you have monitors like the one here that could be transported together with the patient wherever he was within the hospital or in ambulances, etc. Yeah? But still the patient was wired to these big boxes. And it wasn't up to the beginning of the 2000s and 2010 when we started to see advances in ambulatory monitoring. Well, in fact, by 1990, we already have, or by 1980, we already have the first Holter devices, which are basically devices to log ECG data for a few days. Yeah? They were prescribed to detect arrhythmias because some of them are difficult to catch when the patient is visiting the doctor. And by then we have more advanced, as I said, telemedicine systems, ambulatory monitoring, and also we started to see by 2010 onwards the beginning of what Jackie mentioned, artificial intelligence to analyze multiple vital signs and other data from laboratories or even the patient flow into the clinic interventions, etc., into systems like clinical decision support systems and early warning score systems. Yeah. So this is being the evolution, more or less, of this system. I tried to be very brief on that. Then I'm focusing more on these ambulatory systems. I got 3 examples that actually, I've been looking at during my career. The first one in the top is developed by Sotera Wireless, and it's a multi-sensor system that can measure different vital signs. As you can see, it's an end-to-end system. It's partly wireless because the communication from the patient to the actual external environment is done by RF or Wi-Fi. And then the data can be seen or can be accessed by the clinicians, even in the form of a tablet or in a nursing station or a computer station. The system has an important feature that it is capable of monitoring continuous non-invasive blood pressure. Just by taking just one initial cuff-based pressure measurements, it can actually calibrate the system, and apparently they claim they can monitor blood pressure continuously. The 2 systems in the bottom, one is the CardioNet system, and they are just mobile cardiac outpatient telemetry systems. Also the BioFlux system in the bottom. They are prescribed to patients through a subscription model. And basically the patient plugs some ECG electrodes, and in this pendant here is got the processing unit that is relaying information to this wireless device. So therefore the patient, every time there is an arrhythmic event, let's say atrial fibrillation, for example, the system will send a notification to the server, and then clinicians will be able to access that data. It can also be done by the same patient pressing an event button, saying I'm feeling palpitations, whatever, press the button, and then clinicians can straight look at this data and generate reports about the status of the patient to take clinical actions or improve the patient management. Similar system here, the BioFlux. Well, the thing with those systems before, they are already wearable. I call them ambulatory systems because in my own perception, a wearable system is the one that you can use as an accessory, as a clothing accessory, or a system that actually cannot be seen. You can wear it, but is unnoticed. Yeah. So the previous system still got wires and still got different modules to collect data and to relay data, and therefore they make them a little bit more difficult to use, and they increase the burden in the clinical flow. Well, then next, and this was part of my experience too, some of us in outside academic institutions and companies started to develop more wearable system, more wireless, so what we call digital patches. All this came from an idea or from a patent that was published in 1971, already expired. Unfortunately for Louis, the technology wasn't available of a digital patch, but then based on that, different companies jumped into the idea and started to develop all these systems. Basically, the 2 at the top were designed by a company called Corventis, the Nuvant and Avivo patches, which are intended to monitoring cardiac arrhythmias and also to monitor concentration of fluids in patients with congestive heart failure. Same principle, the actual patches are connected to a wireless device which relays the data to a monitoring center for further interpretation analysis by means of clinicians. This one here is developed by a company called iRhythm, and it's called the Xeon patch. It's actually developed to detect about 10 types of different arrhythmias. An interesting fact about this one is that it's been trained with a reasonable large data set. The algorithms, actually deep learning algorithms, developed at Stanford University by Andrew Ng and his colleagues. And today it's in use to actually gather data, same philosophy, trigger events, and then produce reports about the actual status of the patient to triage medication or whatever is required. The last one is a little bit different. That's the Sension patch. I was part of the team who developed all the algorithms going inside the microchip. In fact, I was the director of that team. And basically, this is a disposable patch that's got a very, very small microprocessor, and it relies 3 vital signs: ECG, heart rate, and respiration rate. And all that data is sent to a router or different routers that are installed at different parts of the hospital, and then the data from there go to virtual servers. And then the patient, the actual nurses can see that in their computer screens or tablets, etc. I'm gonna leave you with this video. I don't know how can I play this? So I will tell you more about the Sensium
It's
Vital.
crucial. Patients' vital signs are closely monitored. Well, now a new device is less intrusive and more thorough than ever before. Rich DeMuro explains in today's Tech Report.
Monitoring patients' vital signs is a time-consuming process, but a new device is making it easier and helping nurses to detect important changes faster than ever before. In a hospital, every second counts. Now, new technology is helping to monitor patients more thoroughly than ever before.
Normally, vital signs are taken every 4 hours. This way, it's taken every couple minutes. And if there's a deterioration in the patient, the nurses are alerted immediately.
The product is called Sensium Vitals, basically a bandage packed with electrodes and low-power wireless technology. It can detect changes in temperature, heart rate, and breathing. Information is instantly sent to a computer screen or mobile device.
It's good for patients because it's a very lightweight, non-obtrusive way of monitoring the patients, and it alerts nurses to subtle changes in the patient's condition.
Donna Hendel is in charge of patient care at St. John's Health Center in Santa Monica, the first hospital in the U.S. to use the recently FDA-approved device.
The results have been impressive.
Shorter hospital stays, an average of 6 less days. Plus, since patients wearing the devices can avoid escalating medical issues, hospital bills can be cheaper too.
I'm more or less unaware that they own me. I don't think about something being attached to me.
Very comfortable. I like it, and I feel that it's doing what it is supposed to do about my vital signs.
Each disposable patch has a battery that lasts about 3 days. The real magic is that patients can potentially wear the patch after being discharged, which means hospital-like monitoring in the comfort of home. This technology shows a lot of promise, especially if
I'm sure that in my presentation is okay anyway. So, well, yes, this is basically more of that. I mean, the Sensium Vital Systems is this wearable disposable patch. Lasts for 5 days, easy to attach into the chest using conventional ECG electrodes, plus a kind of telephone cable temperature sensor that goes in the axillary pit. And once it's activated by pulling a tab, then it starts to rely to convey vital signs to either a central monitoring station or to a mobile app. The core of this technology was born in Imperial College of London a few years ago through the actual development of the Sensium system on chip, which got all the sensor interface to do biomedical signal conditioning and acquisition, also a proprietary radio, RF radio, and also local algorithms can run in a small microcontroller which is embedded into the chip. Yeah. Of course, well, people might wonder, okay, yeah, that patch, the only thing it does is actually give you ECG, respiration rate, heart rate, and temperature. But when we come to the ambulatory context, it's not that simple. In the old days, even with the bedside monitors, doctors could see a lot of noise, or still can see a lot of noise. But the good thing is that at least you can see the signals and say, okay, the signal looks corrupted. I'm going just to replace electrodes and maybe they fix the problem. Here, we have patients on the move, and basically the fact that the patients are moving actually generates or introduces more noise into the data. Yeah? And unfortunately, sometimes that noise, or in most of the cases, that noise is actually in band with the physiological signals. Yeah? For example, with respiration signals, with ECG signals, the noise sometimes is in band. The case of ECG is perhaps a little bit simpler to filter them out, but in the case of impedance tomography, respiration signal is more difficult. we also have the fact that some of the clinical conditions and noise are sometimes alike. If you have a very heavy process ECG signal, I mean, let's say, or very heavy high-pass filter ECG signal, and you, and you're trying to detect atrial fibrillation, you might find that some noise might resemble to that and also should be, or would be kind of non-periodic. So you need to consider those factors when you are designing algorithms for detecting certain conditions. Similarly, when you're using impedance pneumography for respiration detection, respiration rate estimation, and somebody's walking very slow, that can actually modulate the noise, and that may confuse again with, and it can get confused with an actual physiological event or noise. Another problem is discrimination between irrelevant and relevant clinical data. When we were developing this patch, I remember that one of the problems, and nurses went to see the patient because apparently there was an alert at the very beginnings, and then the guy was on the mobile phone, and it was a respiration alert. Well, respiration is something that we could voluntarily control, and we can decide to stop breathing on purpose, or when we are talking, what we are doing is modulating our voice with air, and that's not clinical respiration. So we need to account for all those challenges just to be able to detect those three vital signs in a very, very reliable manner. Another problem was no conventional ECG lead positions. Most of the algorithms in past, we could adopt an existing algorithm, let's say, for the sake of argument, QRS detection, Pan and Tompkins algorithm, and put it into the patch, but then we realized that now the waveform shapes were different. You have taller T waveforms that were at the beginning being detected as peaks. So then you need to tune those algorithms. So, well, basically, after addressing all these challenges, I think the aim of everybody doing this is mainly try to meet the best trade-off between false and true detections of adverse events, and also the true detection of clinical conditions. As you can see here, this is just an example of a true positive signal compared with a capnography signal. The blue is a Sensium vital signal, the red is a capnography signal. When actually it's detecting a good respiration signal, it will report the rate. When, in this case, in the true negative, when the signals are corrupted, what it will do is just reject the rate, but there will be cases where you have false positive, that you want to report a rate from a noisy signal, or false negative, that you won't report anything in the presence of a genuine signal or alert. So then what we need to do, or what people do, is try to, if we look at the simplest of the machine learning algorithm, which is just moving a threshold, what people would do is try to put the threshold so that it's not too conservative, because then it will miss a lot of real events, or move it towards, or make it more relaxed, but in that case you will have a lot of cry wolf effect, alert fatigue, because it will come up with a lot of noise. So basically finding this compromise, it's not as simple as moving those thresholds. And this is when we apply a little bit of machine learning to resolve the problem, as well as other solutions. Yeah. The simplest one is here. Somebody can say, well, why don't you add an accelerometer? It's a valid assumption, and then you know when the patient is moving, and perhaps you also know the intensity of that movement. You can tell, well, I can set a threshold that when the magnitude of the accelerations are beyond certain level, then I will reject those signals. That's a very easy solution. There are other more complex, like noise cancellation techniques. You have a corrupted signal, and perhaps you have a reference signal, and then you apply something like adaptive filtering or independent component analysis to get rid of the noise. The thing with this is that if, for example, you use an accelerometer as a reference signal, the actual accelerometer, the way the actual response of the accelerometer with respect to the response of the changes in the impedance of the electrodes is completely different. It's very difficult to really remove the noise like that. Another thing you can do is apply time frequency domain methods like short time Fourier transform, and you will see the difference between corrupted and good signals, or derive, if the signal is very corrupted like this one, actually, this is respiration, this one here, derive that from another signal. We can derive respiration from the ECG, for example. Yeah. Or my favorite one, which is for this kind of devices, is apply a machine learning verification algorithm, a machine learning algorithm for verification of the quality of the signal, which is something similar to this here. Again, you need to think, because this is going to run locally in a portable device, you need to think about a very, very, or by the time we did it, we need to think about a very, very simple approach. In this case, it's a very, well, you can adopt a very small neural network, or logistic regression, or you can adopt a support vector machine. But the idea there is to reduce the dimensionality of the feature space. At the beginning, you can have about 200 features, and then we apply feature selection methods to actually constrain that to at least 2 or 3 features that you can see in this figure here, in this probabilistic output that we have here. Basically, algorithms like that will actually be able, with the right thresholds, to tell you when it's reliable to take the respiration rate, for example, in this case, when it's okay to actually reject the value because the signal is corrupted, and there is a fuzzy region in the middle, which is a tough one, where we are unsure, or there is still uncertainty about the quality of the signal. However, that could be mitigated by looking at historic data, and also looking at prior information about the patient conditions too. Yeah. Another example is detecting conditions. This is something that we are developing in another company we founded in Canada a few months ago. Basically, it's a simple one. Many people have done this already. In fact, I started doing this from 2000, which is AF detection or arrhythmia detection. So then basically the pipeline is similar. You just process the ECG, get the QRS, get the R2R intervals, generate a set of features around that, and then normalize those features, and then apply some sort of dimensionality reduction, either by feature selection or feature extraction. Once you have reduced the feature space, you actually pass the data through an AF classifier. Could be a probabilistic, again, logistic regression, or it could be a neural network, whatever it is, and then you have a probability of being or not being atrial fibrillation. So to see some of that, I mean, you can see in this case, we transform the features using principal component analysis, and then created 2 models, 2 simple models to detect the actual incidence of atrial fibrillation. Here I'm just showing quickly the pipeline that we follow to develop wearable machine learning and local processing technologies. I don't want to go through the pipeline. I just want to highlight that what is important here is that at every stage we need to have reliable data to be able to develop reliable models. Algorithmic solutions for these systems are as good or can be as complex depending on the amount of data you have available. Yeah. Okay, so what's been the role of doctors in our experience helping us with this kind of developing these technologies? Well, I was talking about data. There have been a lot of efforts in the United States, in Beth Israel Hospital, developing resources like Physionet, which is a compendium of different databases ranging from simple waveforms to more complex data that involve parameters like lab results and medications. And then once we use this data to originally develop our algorithms, then what we do next is to validate that with the help of clinicians that put in place studies to do so, and then help us to disseminate the results around those findings. Yeah. Well, we now have a lot of data. We can see that wearable devices, I think Jackie said that already, are actually growing the size of the data exponentially. We have different type of data. You can see we have lab results, we have medications, we have trends of vital signs. So what we need to, well, or at the moment what is happening is clinical institutions are working together with data science teams to develop intelligent clinical decision support systems based on predictive analytics. We already know that. But the expectations are the doctors continue to help us to interpret this data and understand what of these data are actually irrelevant and what are the most important aspects or trends of data that we can use to accelerate and come up with reliable predictions. Yeah. Well, to conclude, you could see that doctors have been involved from the beginning in the evolution of patient monitoring. They also, in my experience, developing wearable devices and systems, they have contributed to develop those systems and validate them. Ongoing developments now are focused on interpretation of large and different types of data, combining, as I mentioned, different types, and also using, again, methods like based more on deep learning on one side, and there are others that favor more Bayesian learning on another side. And at this stage of the evolution of wearable monitoring, artificial intelligence and cloud computing, the expert knowledge of the doctor is required more than ever to turn the outputs into actionable strategies, to help us to manage and treat patients. Well, thank you very much. As you see, the wearable systems and algorithms are definitely changing the face of healthcare monitoring. Thank you. And if you want to know more, there are some suggestions to read if you really want to know more. Thank you very much. That was fast.
Very quickly, you've mentioned a lot about monitoring, clinical monitoring, wearables, and a lovely distinction between ambulatory and wearable.
Sure.
One of the things that is noticeably absent was measuring blood pressure. I wanted to know what challenges you had in terms of recording blood pressure as a wearable.
Okay, yes. One of the challenges is that in the clinical setting, when we're actually monitoring patients, especially at night, taking blood pressure measurements using the oscillometric method, using a cuff, could be a little bit disturbing. That will, for example, where patients are. I'm talking outside intensive care units. I'm talking more about the general wards, where patients tend to deteriorate more. So doing that, first of all, is disruptive, and secondly, it will, let's say, it could cause injury if you do it too often. So then the solutions that are in place, or we're trying to investigate at the moment, like the way I have a student who's sitting in the back there, developing algorithms for continuous non-invasive blood pressure, but cuffless. A lot of efforts have been done around pulse transient time, measuring the time it takes for the RP to some part of the pulse oximeter waveform, and they try to correlate that with blood pressure measurements. It's a long explanation, but unfortunately I don't believe they are still yet. So that's why we're carrying on trying to develop these technologies that only require at least one sensor. So.
Thanks. Just on that, thank you. Just on that note, actually, I'm Dr. Sandeep Shah. Trillion Laser Technologies has actually developed a unique continuous method of blood pressure measurement. You may know Trillion Laser Technologies, which has been proven at the Barts Heart Center. We're actually launching this in 2 weeks' time at the European Society of Hypertension. So it's a small micro optoelectronic sensor which basically delivers beat-to-beat continuous blood pressure measurement in any vascular bed in the body. And you may have... No, it's not. It's using optical power modulation, which is a technique that we've developed and patented. I can have a chat with you afterwards. Yeah. But just to say that with the paradigms actually being broken, and we've actually developed the solution.
Well, we are working, we still are inclined to investigate a little bit more the PPG, given that the popularity of the sensor.
So, actually, being a senior clinical fellow at the Barts Heart Center, the problem with PPG is actually that it only technically penetrates around 2 millimeters of the dermis at best, so you don't actually reach any major vascular structure from which you can then correlate meaningful blood pressure. So that, I think these systems have a problem. The power of optical power modulation is that you get a very resolute and reliable signal which actually correlates directly with deep intraarterial pressure. And again, if you read our patents and our publications, you'll see that.
Thank you. One final question. Oh, sorry.
Hi. Obviously, the scope for personalised medicine, for continuous monitoring is just growing and growing and growing, and therefore the data is. One of the examples was obviously monitoring people in hospital and possibly out of hospital, but with such a volume of data, is there not a need to know when not to worry? You know, to actually use all of this data to therefore not flood clinicians with information. And you know, given that actually the brain is much a black box as any AI, and the only way we deal with that is by training them and making them certified and based on their experience. Presumably we need some form of certification or qualification of those techniques that then exclude the irrelevant data from either a clinician or the worried well.
Well, again, this is part of what I've been trying to say. I mean, at the moment we have too much data available, and again, some of the data could be redundant or irrelevant, and this is where we need the help to continue receiving the help of doctors to help us understanding which of this data could be removed based on their experience. On another token, I think you were asking about when not to worry. Were you referring to the actual patient not worsening his condition?
Well, I think there's two people who might worry unnecessarily. One is the worried well, and the other is the clinician who's bombarded with, everything's normal, and you don't need to know that. The clinician doesn't need to know that everything's normal. Maybe the patient does, but so you've got.
Yeah, well, I can see that point. The problem is that sometimes it's difficult to even know whether the patient is normal in the presence of stable vital signs. And I could mention that in the case of sepsis, for example, when it's uncomplicated. Yeah, my understanding is that the vital signs don't vary that much, and then you need to look for other pieces of information. Does it make sense? So actually making that just from actually looking at a monitor screen perhaps is not that simple. Maybe we need more algorithms to come up looking at different features that are at the moment not being studied enough. Yeah.
Thank you, Miguel.
Thank you.
Now,